Good morning, everyone. This is Fareed Vij from ZL Technologies. Thank you very much for joining us today for part two of our Don't Be Afraid of the Dark webinar series, How to Start Your File Cleanup Project. Today I'm happy to introduce, together with myself, two colleagues that will be joining us for today's discussion. Bennett Borden, a DBNR, who's Chief Legal Counsel and a data scientist, a rare breed that we see in today's world, as well as Heyman Salem, who heads up the information governance practice here at ZL Technologies. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Yeah, likewise.
So with that, let's get started. Like I said, we're joined here by Bennett Borden, Heyman Salem, and myself. And today's agenda is really focused on a success story that we have seen with a large healthcare company that has taken on the challenge of file share cleanup from a governance and data remediation perspective. What we're going to do is first cover some of the challenges and goals that they had at the outset of their initiative, as well as the three key steps that they took in order to launch a successful campaign. The discussion will obviously be supplemented with industry best practices, and we'll make sure to get Bennett and Heyman's perspective here as well. I believe the poll question should be coming on here in a second, but just to provide a little bit of background on this project itself, this healthcare company had approximately a little bit over 1 petabyte of unmanaged, unstructured content, primarily on file shares that they were looking to address. Their general counsel's office had several concerns around e-discovery risks that those data sets posed, as far as sensitive data that was unsecured, data that might need to be preserved that had not been preserved, and data that might be being inadvertently disposed of when in fact it had not met its retention period. Simultaneously, they got a lot of buy-in from their CIO, who was looking to reduce storage costs and ongoing management costs for a lot of this content, much of which they felt may not even be needed within the organization, which is part of the onus to start this project. Looking at their project goals, really what they were attempting to do was one, to reduce the amount of storage that they had in place by at least 50%, and that was obviously a goal on the IT side. Classify information into large buckets for further analysis, and build a defensible remediation strategy and set of policies to get rid of data that wasn't required or quarantine data that was required. And I apologize, I seem to be having some technical difficulty here with the slide deck. Here we are. As well as identify and preserve any legal hold data. So those were the key points that they were really looking to address. With that, Heyman, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the first three steps to look at when you're launching your file share project? I know you're also familiar with this client, so maybe you can speak in that context.
Sure, thank you, Fareed. Like most projects, it goes into the the people, process, and technology buckets. The first thing you want to do is make sure that you get your key stakeholders together. With this client, the primary focus was from the GC's office and the CIO's office in terms of making sure that, first of all, that they were able to clear out a fair bit of data, but at the same time also protect the information that was critical to the company, both from an obligatory perspective as well as from an e-discovery perspective and a business operation perspective. As we'll go further into the webinar, we'll see some of the other stakeholders that you have to think about as well. And even though this one client had about 1 petabyte of data to work on, some of these principles apply to even companies who have smaller data sets, even in a few terabytes. Some of the same principles apply. Once you've identified the stakeholders and you understand why you're doing the project, what are some of the key drivers, the next key thing to keep in mind is focusing on the bigger buckets of information. When you look at 1 petabyte of data, it can be pretty overwhelming in terms of trying to classify every little detail of it. But there's a lot to be gained at looking at the larger buckets and going after the most important information. And we'll talk about that in more detail down the road as well. And then the third very critical item is making sure that you pick the right approach from a technology perspective, so that as you get started and build on your project, it's going to grow with you and support your entire needs.
Great, thanks a lot, Heyman. That's actually a really nice segue. We're going to ask Bennett here in a couple minutes to talk from both a legal and a data scientist perspective as to how to approach data remediation. But before we get there, just if you attended our first webinar, which was primarily around how to get buy-in within your organization to get an initiative like this off the ground, this was one graphic that we had shared at the time from the Information Governance Initiative Annual Report, which took a look at all the different stakeholders that are involved within an organization for an initiative around data remediation. And you can see from here that there's a number of different stakeholders that need to be at the table, but one thing that was absolutely critical for the success of these projects was ensuring that there was a clear lead or a clear lead stakeholder that really owned the project and owned the process, and at the same time kept the rest of the committee involved. So what we saw is 94% of these committees obviously had folks from records and information management, 89% information security, so on and so forth. But this is a great way to sort of check the boxes on your side to make sure that you have all these people at the table, and in addition to just setting up the committee, what's absolutely critical is to ensure that there is someone leading the initiative that actually owns this process and is able to move it forward. So with that, Bennett, we're gonna move over to a little bit about data remediation. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how folks should be looking at this, both from a legal as well as a data perspective.
Thanks, Reed. Yes, when you think about what remediation is, we often think about that it's getting rid of information, but the point of it actually is the information that you're keeping, right? It's a way to figure out what's important to the company for business, regulatory, and legal reasons, and keeping that. It is kind of a byproduct of that is getting rid of data. And so often, if we focus on what's important to the company and what to keep, then it is a key principle behind which we organize a remediation project. It's also really important to think about tactically what are the costs and benefits of remediation projects, and really trying to get some quantification around the idea that there's risk in keeping data that you don't need, whether it's regulatory risk, whether it's security, privacy, breaches, the right to be forgotten, just discovery costs, storage costs. There's a cost in keeping information you don't need. And there's also a risk in getting rid of stuff you do need, right? So throwing away stuff that you're supposed to keep carries with it different risks. And it's important to understand those, however, because often we see that companies overestimate the risk of getting rid of something erroneously. And as we'll talk about some today, there's 3 reasons why you keep something. The business needs it, you need it for regulatory purposes, or you've got some kind of preservation duty, are the 3 primary ones. And usually the first 2 are fairly well taken care of. Companies, if you lose some business information, the vast majority of that one single piece of information is not that critical to the company. On the regulatory side, companies usually have a pretty good handle on regulated information. It's usually structured versus unstructured, and to the extent that it is unstructured, they usually have pretty good systems in place. So it's really on the preservation side, and especially with the amendments to the federal rules that have come into place in December of 2015 that amended the sanctions framework, it's actually quite difficult to get in trouble for getting rid of something if you have any colorable, reasonable process of deleting or remediating data. And so often we find that it's really important to understand what your actual risks are for both keeping and getting rid of something, and also understand that there's a cost in gaining visibility. As we'll talk about a lot today, the point of a remediation project is to gain just enough information to make a remediation decision and understand what the cost of that is. There's always cost in getting more information, or information cost. And so you're trying to balance this idea of gaining just enough information to make a remediation decision and balance that against these other risks we talked about.
Thanks a lot, Bennett. And that's one point that I think we really want to emphasize. And I know in conversations with Bennett that's something that was very interesting for me to hear personally as well, that the key is, again, to find just enough information to be able to make a remediation decision, which I think is something we all struggle with quite a bit, that what is that balance that, you know, what could be out there in the data that, you know, to what detail or what depth do we need to go into the data to really make a decision around whether to keep it or delete it. And I think, Bennett, that's a really interesting point to talk about, is, you know, that it's really getting just enough information to be able to make the decision, as opposed to being able to get as much information as you can, as many of us often try to do. So I know we talked a little bit about sort of the big bucket approach, but maybe you could speak a little bit to that, as to, you know, how do you actually go about creating those buckets, and what's the process to actually start classifying data into those various buckets?
Yes, when you start a remediation project and you identify your target data source, so in this case, you know, a file share of data, it could be SharePoint sites, it can be email repositories, whether live or archived, really anything you're looking at, but let's click file share. You gain initial insight or visibility into that data, usually through some kind of technological process where you at least get a picture of its metadata and sometimes content, and we'll talk a little bit about the difference in cost of those things and whether you get a benefit out of that. But you get this initial visibility layer, and you're able to classify or categorize the data really into three buckets. You have enough information to know that I want to keep this stuff, and that goes into kind of your one bucket. You have enough information to know you don't want this, and that's your middle bucket. And then you've got this third bucket, which is I don't have enough information to make a decision either way. And fundamentally what a remediation project is about is gaining enough information about different slices of this middle insufficient information bucket to move that slice or chunk into one of the other two, keep or delete. And you can make decisions pretty quickly on large chunks of this data. So if you think about even on the metadata side, right, looking at things like the dates of these documents or the data in the repository, usually what we do is we work with a company, figure out what its kind of longest retention period is. It's non-permanent. We do some work to find those permanent things. And then anything that's over your longest retention period that isn't a permanent record, just delete. There's no question involved. You don't have to check it. You don't have to really do anything. As long as it's older than your oldest, you just get rid of it. So that's one big chunk that you can move into your delete pile. The same thing works with, say, file types. You know, often what we will do is we'll look for all the iTunes backups and the picture files if you're a company that doesn't have pictures as records, or, you know, whatever it is, and find all kinds of file types you can simply identify as a group and throw over the wall into the must delete bucket. You can do the same thing even with folder names, and this gets us to the idea of just enough information. So let's say you've got a folder on your shared drive that says, you know, Christmas Party 2002. Well, you can legally rely on a business classification or a business record. And so the fact that this folder says Christmas Party 2002, you can rely on that to make a remediation decision. Now, depending on your appetite for risk, you may want to glance in the folder to make sure someone hasn't, you know, used that as a way to hide, you know, the secret files of their fraud. But with a very cursory evaluation, you can take that entire folder and remediate it. And it's actually important that this concept of getting just enough information to make a decision, because if you start getting too much information, if you look too hard, you're going to find errors or in your classification, no matter what it is. where things are saved in the wrong folder or named the wrong thing, or this is especially true of like hard copy documents in the inventory spreadsheets. You'll find things that are mislabeled, because if you start finding those errors, it throws your entire classification system or categorization system into doubt, and it starts to actually weaken your entire program. So it's important to really understand this idea that you want to gain just enough information on these big chunks of data to make a remediation decision that's defensible. Because the goal here is not always you want to get your decisions 100% correct, which is frankly impossible. Sometimes your goal is, I want to do enough that I'm not getting to get in trouble for getting it wrong, and those are two very different goals.
Right, right. No, thank you, Bennett. I mean, I think, I think that one of the challenges that people face, so when they're looking at this, and Hemant, you might have a perspective on it, on this piece, is obviously we have these three large buckets. We have, like, as Bennett said, the must-delete stuff, where we can look at certain data types. You use the Christmas party pictures example. You have must-keep data, which is things that are clear records, annual statements or other stuff that you might find out there, or something like legal hold data, stuff that belongs to a custodian that, where data needs to be preserved. But you have this middle bucket, which is really where it seems the bulk of the work goes in. So, Hemant, how do you actually, when you look at the technology piece, how do you sort of balance that out? Where obviously, like Bennett is saying, you don't want to go overkill and go to the nth degree of detail on every piece of content, but at the same time, you do need technology that helps you strike that balance. So, I mean, what are some of the ways that you can actually leverage the technology to help create those buckets?
So, Fareed, that's a good question, and what we've done with this client and other clients as well is use a somewhat of an iterative approach, and this is something that you can use on an ongoing basis as well. The first thing, like Bennett pointed out, is you want to go after the stuff that is high value, easy to classify, and that's why getting your stakeholders in, and into the process early on is helpful, because some of these are pieces of information that you will get from your stakeholders along with the use of technology to go and find information. Certain folders where they may have legal hold information, or with this client we found a fair bit of information that was classified as things like board documents and other kinds of financial information, which the finance department had very well organized. And then those are things that you can pretty quickly identify and move. And where technology comes in is when you have large volumes of data, having technology that can go crawl the file space and give you summary reports saying, hey, these are some of the folders you might want to look at which have certain kinds of data. Going back to the example of financial records and things like that, they had certain output from some of their systems which were of a certain file type, and we could immediately identify where they were located, in addition to things like ADP reports and other kinds of HR information, which helped us quickly identify where HR information was being kept. Now, on the flip side of it, we were also able to use technology to go find folders that were full of photographs and other kinds of media, and giving people immediate visibility into that helped them move those into the do not keep bucket pretty quickly as well. So that's the initial discovery aspect that that you can do at the metadata level. And then once you've done that, you want to take a deeper look at it. And it's, as you can imagine, it's impossible for you to go open and process every file if you have 1 petabyte of data to look at. But we were able to use sampling technology to very quickly go and look for critical pieces of information and data stores that we could classify as well. Going back to what Bennett was saying, you don't need to have 100% accuracy or confidence having looked at every file, but using statistical principles, you can get very high probability or confidence levels, up to 98% or 99%, whether or not you have certain kinds of data sitting in certain folders. Now, this can be used whether it's for classifying the information, looking for certain kinds of financial information or IP-related information that you want to protect, or from a security perspective, you could look for PII, PCI, and other kinds of protected information that you do not want lying around that you could go back and protect. And that's where the sampling technology combined with the advanced analytics, where you're looking into the content of the data, becomes very critical, because metadata can only get you so far, right? And as you deal with larger data volumes, it gets more and more difficult to go in and precisely look at various pieces of information.
Right.
And yeah. And once you're, go ahead. Now, once you're done with the advanced analytics, you also want to use that to actually classify your content and do something with it. And doing something with it, typically people think of it as, hey, I'm going to go delete certain information or keep certain information intact. But what a good practice that we've seen some of the successful companies use is start building policies right as you're looking at this. For example, if you can identify certain types of information, documents that have PII, or documents that are stored in certain folders, or documents that are accessed by certain people within the company, any folder that is accessible to the HR group and only the HR group, you could classify those as HR documents and start setting policies right at that point, and that can smoothly take you into the information governance arena. So this is not a one-time, I go look at 1 petabyte of data and I classify it, and then by the time I'm done, I have to go back and redo it because there's been new content created or data has been moved. By setting up these policies using advanced technologies and tying it into information governance platforms, you can then ease the maintenance of whatever you've done going forward.
Thanks, Hemant. Thanks for that input. And I think that's, you talked a little bit about sampling, which I found interesting, where going back to Bennett's point about getting just enough information to be able to make a decision. Bennett, how does sort of sampling, I think there's two real key points I was hoping to get your comments on that Hemant mentioned. One is obviously that this is an iterative process where, even as this graphics shows, you first discover your data, figure out the metadata, you do some more advanced analysis, you help classify content, and then you try to take some policy-based action, whether that's remediating the data by quarantining it for legal hold or putting it into a file plan or a governance platform or, getting rid of it altogether so that it leads to broader information governance. And the second piece was really about leveraging sampling in sort of the number 2 and number 3 between advanced analytics and content classification in order to get to that policy-based action. So keeping those two things in mind, that you're approaching this so that you can put larger information governance practices in place and not do this as a one-time activity, as well as using things like sampling. How does that sort of fit into making sure you get to that critical enough information, if you will, to actually make that policy-based action?
Those are some really good points, Reed, and there's really 3 distinct points there. One is that your process is principle-based or policy-based, right? If you think about, especially if you're looking at the defensibility of your process, defensibility in almost every realm that's related to keeping or getting rid of data is based on this principle of reasonableness. And so did you take reasonable efforts to fulfill your either preservation duty or regulatory duty? There's very few kind of strict liability areas of when it comes to record keeping. So what does reasonable mean? Reasonable means you had a reason to do it that wasn't stupid, right, is really what it comes down to. And so if you are making decisions, if your process is reasonable, you're getting a good visibility, you're making decisions based on good evidence, that's really going to get you past almost all severe liability that you run into. And so this is where sampling comes in as well, which is the second point. Sampling is absolutely widely accepted as a way of proving the content of something. It's the scientific levels of statistical evidence, things like your confidence level in interval, have been widely accepted across the courts in a bunch of different areas for decades. And so being able to take a sample of your data, especially like a 95, what they call a 95.5 sample or a 95.3 sample, and saying, look, I looked at all these things that had the file name of this or were in this folder or created by these people or this department, and I looked at a statistically valid sample, I can make inferences about the rest of that. If you document that process and make good inferences and have a good sample, it's completely defensible to do that. And the third point of that is you absolutely don't want to make this a one-time project and clean up what we call looking back, right, the look back cleanup. You want to have something that's going to keep this big pile or lake of data from forming again. So we always talk about the idea of draining the swamp, meaning get rid of the legacy stuff, but you also have to dam the stream, meaning that you want to have processes going forward that help to auto-categorize or manually categorize if you have to data so that it's naturally falling into organized buckets as opposed to having to clean it up periodically.
Great.
Yeah, one other thing I wanted to bring up also is, we're talking about file system at this point, but files reside on other kind of data sources as well, like SharePoint sites and various other systems where you can have files, and applying these kinds of policy-based approach can then be brought into those realms as well.
Thanks, Heyman. Thanks. And that's a really fair point. I mean, obviously in this context with this particular client and case study, we're talking primarily file shares. But that's a really good point. Is data remediation is obviously not data, data type specific. But file shares is often where we're seeing a lot of people start these projects. So let's take a quick look at what some of the results this client saw, from this initiative that they put together. So at the end of their project, what they were able to do was, a little technical difficulty here again. What they were able to do was reduce their total unstructured data by 68% purely by identifying rot, redundant, outdated, and trivial information. So this is information that didn't serve, one of the following three purposes. It wasn't critical to the business, it wasn't critical for regulatory purposes, and it wasn't critical for legal or e-discovery purposes. So using that as sort of the broader checkbox, about 68% reduction was purely from rot data. So that's very much that must delete bucket. About 32%, that was actually what they were able to get to first. There was about 32% then that fell into the, hey, we need to analyze this further, or this is information, this is where we don't have enough information. As they delved into that a little bit more, they found about 17% of the total content could be identified as a clear record that actually fit in their existing records plan, and this is why they put in place a platform that would not just allow them to clean this data up, but actually store it long term. And they also found about 22% of data that was sensitive or high-risk data that was unsecured, that people had access to where they shouldn't. Now, the 17 and 22, there was some overlap there. There was some sensitive information that ended up being records, but one way or the other, they had to find a way to remediate it. Moving forward, what was absolutely critical to their success was, again, having a platform in place that not only allowed the cleanup, but the ongoing policy management and an ongoing process for file analysis so that it's not just a look-back activity, as Bennett was emphasizing. So we're almost here at the end of the 30 minutes. So some of the key takeaways, and you might see a poll come up here in a second, our second poll for the webinar. But some of the key takeaways, obviously, were, one is to really make sure that you identify what the key project drivers are to secure buy-in from your leadership. And the three areas that we've seen get traction are really, cost, as Bennett said, the cost of managing this data, storing this data, security, the risk that having a bunch of data out there that is unsecured, what risk that poses. Everyone is very concerned with data breaches and cybersecurity issues, when in fact what people are realizing is there's all this content within our organization that folks have access to that could create a major issue. And then obviously legal and governance, which is sort of the overlay, which is making sure on an ongoing basis we're identifying and classifying this information and ensuring that we're managing it to find that balance between risk and cost. A second key step to take is obviously look at take an internal inventory. Figure out what are the data types that are most critical for us to analyze. The reason we're seeing people look at file shares so much is it's just a bunch of shared storage. It's very difficult to actually understand what we have. But really look at your organizations, figure out who are the key stakeholders, which are the key departments that are creating most of this data or might have the most sensitive data, and find a place to start. Because again, this won't happen overnight. This is an ongoing process, but to really be able to figure out what those low-hanging fruit are that can get the initiative off the ground. And then finally, understand the available technologies that are out there. It's very easy to only look at this purely from a cleanup perspective, but as our panelists both emphasized, it's absolutely critical to make sure that whatever technology you have in place doesn't only allow you to clean up the data, classify the data, but to manage it on an ongoing basis, so that you're not, you don't end up with this problem again in a few years' time, and you actually have a process in place that allows you to manage this on an ongoing basis. If you need some insight on how to get your initiative off the ground, or you already have it in place and you're facing some challenges, feel free to email in to get a 30-minute consultation or with any other questions. And with that, again, a big thank you to our panelists for joining us today, for everyone who joined us here for the webinar. We will have part 3 of this webinar series coming here in a few weeks' time, so stay tuned for that. And feel free to reach out for anything else. Thank you very much, and have a great afternoon.